The Imperial Japanese Navy called its carrier pilots the shining spears of the fleet. That was the institutional language, not poetry, not informal praise, but the actual terminology that the Naval Aviation Command used to describe the men who flew from the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. The carriers themselves were described in Naval Ministry publications as the vanguard of Japanese sea power, the instruments through which the fleet's reach extended beyond the horizon, and the decisive battle could be fought at ranges the guns of capital ships could never achieve. The men who flew from them were the best aviators the Japanese training system could produce. The men who maintained the ships, fueled the aircraft, handled the weapons, managed the engineering plant. They were told they served the finest expression of modern naval power that any navy in the world had committed to see. What the Naval Ministry's publications did not describe was what happened on the hangar deck of Shokaku on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when American fighters from the Essex-class carriers destroyed 243 Japanese aircraft in a single day's fighting. The American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese called it the Battle of the Philippine Sea in their official records and did not publish the casualty figures. The men on the carrier decks who watched their air groups return, depleted and then not return at all, understood, without requiring any official briefing, that what was happening above them was not the shining spear of the fleet at its work. It was the systematic destruction of everything the carriers had been built to project, by an American air defense that had been specifically engineered for exactly this result, in a battle the Japanese carrier force had been sent to win, and could not win and would not recover from. The doctrine had promised a different outcome. Here is what the documented reality produced instead. Begin with the machine and the men's place inside it, because the Japanese carrier's physical architecture expressed the Imperial Navy's institutional philosophy as directly as any formal statement of policy, and because the specific features of that philosophy imposed conditions on the men who served in these ships that the Shining Spear narrative had not been written to accommodate. The Shokaku-class carrier, the two ships Shokaku and Zuikaku that formed the core of the experienced Japanese carrier force from December 1941 onward, displaced 29,800 tons at standard load and 32,105 tons at full combat load. She measured 257.5 meters from stem to stern, with a flight deck extending 242.2 meters and a beam of 26 meters at the waterline. Her machinery plant was 8 Campon boilers feeding 4 geared turbines developing 160,000 shaft horsepower, driving the ship to a maximum speed of 34.2 knots. She carried a wartime air group of approximately 72 to 84 aircraft, and a total crew, ship's company plus air group personnel, of approximately 1,660 men. She was, by every engineering measurement available in 1941, among the finest carrier designs in the world. The American naval analysts who examined her specifications after the war confirmed this assessment. Her aviation fuel stowage, her aircraft handling system, her protective scheme, all were designed with the operational experience of a navy that had thought hard about carrier warfare and had invested the design resources to reflect that thinking. Her aviation fuel system was also the mechanism by which she died. The Imperial Japanese Navy's aviation fuel handling procedures on its fleet carriers reflected a set of design and operational choices that the war's first 2 years did not fully reveal as catastrophic, and that the third year revealed completely. Japanese fleet carriers stored their aviation fuel in tanks positioned within the hull's protection scheme, with drainage and venting systems designed to manage the fuel safely during normal operations. The procedures governing fuel system management during combat, when to drain lines, when to maintain pressure, when to vent, were developed for the operational conditions the pre-war planning had anticipated and were not, in the specific way that all pre-war planning is not, developed for the conditions that actually materialized. The conditions that actually materialized included American air attacks on carriers whose fuel systems were in various states of readiness, depending on the phase of flight operations they were supporting when the attack arrived. When a Japanese carrier was hit by a bomb or torpedo while her aviation fuel lines were under pressure for flight operations, the fuel system's specific design characteristics became the determining factor in whether the damage was contained or catastrophic. American carriers hit under similar circumstances. HMS Illustrious, USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown demonstrated that armored flight decks and specific fuel system management procedures could limit the damage that a bomb hit produced. Japanese fleet carriers, which had prioritized aircraft capacity over armored flight decks, demonstrated the other result. At Midway on June 4, 1942, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were all in the process of rearming and refueling aircraft when the American dive bombers arrived. The details of what exactly was fueled and armed and positioned on the hangar decks when the bombs hit has been the subject of analysis ever since, and the specifics matter less than the general truth they reveal. 3 Japanese fleet carriers, each with experienced crews and capable aircraft and trained pilots, were fatally damaged in approximately 5 minutes of dive bomber attack, because the combination of armed aircraft, full fuel loads, unprotected ordnance, and uncontained aviation fuel produced a cascade of secondary explosions that the damage control procedures of the era could not stop. The men in those hangar decks and the spaces below them did not die because their training was inadequate or their commitment was insufficient. They died because the ship's design, the operational tempo that had the aircraft rearmed and refueled for a new strike at the moment the American attack arrived, and the specific chemistry of aviation fuel and armed ordnance in an enclosed steel space produced outcomes that exceeded what any available damage control response could contain. 2,500 men died on the 3 carriers at Midway, many of them in the first minutes of the attack, many more in the hours afterward, as ships that were still afloat and still burning were eventually abandoned or scuttled. The survivors went into the Pacific, and the destroyers assigned to screen the carriers recovered many of them, and the ones who were recovered went back to Japan and waited for new assignments, because the ships they had served on were gone, and the ships that would replace them had not yet been built. Before the combat took what it took, there was the existence aboard these ships, the daily physical reality of serving on a Japanese carrier in wartime. And that existence had its own specific character that the Shining Spear narrative had not described, and that no amount of institutional pride could alter. The enlisted men who formed the bulk of a Japanese carrier's crew, the hangar deck workers, the engineering ratings, the damage control parties, the ammunition handlers, the men who maintained the aircraft between flights and fueled them and armed them and pushed them into position, were organized within a social structure that the Imperial Japanese Navy had inherited from the Meiji-era naval institution and had not meaningfully revised in the decades since. The distinction between officers and enlisted men in the Japanese naval culture of 1941 was not simply the functional distinction between those who commanded and those who executed. It was a categorical distinction between persons of different social status who inhabited the same ship as fundamentally different categories of human being. Officers ate separately, bathed separately, moved through separate spaces, and were addressed by enlisted men with forms of deference that the Western observer would find striking in their formality and their pervasiveness. This was not unique to the Japanese Navy. Every navy in the world in 1941 maintained officer and enlisted distinctions. But the degree to which it structured every interaction and the specific cultural weight it carried in the Japanese institutional context was distinctive. The social distance between a naval ensign and a petty officer first class on a Japanese carrier in 1942 was not the functional gap between a junior manager and a senior technician. It was a gulf maintained by elaborate behavioral protocols that both parties were required to observe at all times, and that allowed essentially no informal crossing. The practical effect on the enlisted men's experience of carrier service was this: the men who actually maintained the aircraft, who actually loaded the bombs and the torpedoes, who actually fueled the planes and pushed them into position and worked the hangar deck through every phase of flight operations. These men performed the work that the carrier's offensive capability depended on, and they performed it within an institutional framework that did not acknowledge their contribution in any terms the men could have described as personal recognition. The aircraft flew. The mission was accomplished. The results were credited to the air group and its commanders. The men on the hangar deck went back to their spaces and prepared the next aircraft. The hangar deck itself was the environment that structured most of the enlisted ships' companies' working lives, and it was an environment that the Imperial Navy's doctrine had optimized for aircraft throughput in ways that imposed specific costs on the men working in it. Japanese fleet carriers of the Shokaku class had two-deck hangars, an upper and lower hangar, capable of accommodating the full air group in protected below-deck stowage. This gave Japanese carriers a significantly larger total aircraft capacity than American carriers of comparable size, at the cost of the armored flight deck that British carriers carried. It also created an enclosed hangar environment in tropical waters that accumulated heat from the aircraft engines, the ordnance handling equipment, the welding and maintenance work, and the sheer density of machinery and fuel in a space that was sealed against the weather and ventilated by systems that moved tropical air at 88 degrees and 80% humidity, through a space that added its own heat to whatever the outside provided. The hangar deck workers in tropical operations sweated through their uniforms within the first hour of a shift, and remained in that condition for the duration. The work was physically demanding, positioning 3,000-kilogram aircraft by hand, maneuvering ordnance, managing fuel hoses under pressure, conducting maintenance in spaces between aircraft that required awkward postures and sustained physical effort in sustained heat. The men did this work on rations that had been adequate in the first year of the war, and that declined in quality, and sometimes in quantity, as the American submarine campaign against Japanese supply shipping intensified through 1943 and into 1944. The food on Japanese fleet carriers occupied the same position in crew experience that it occupied on every Japanese warship. Rice as the caloric foundation, supplemented by preserved fish, pickled vegetables, miso, and fresh provisions for the first days after leaving port, and nothing fresh thereafter. The quality of the preserved provisions declined measurably between 1942 and 1944, as the logistics system managing the fleet's supply was subjected to the competing demands of the war economy and the American submarines' systematic attacks on the tankers and supply ships that brought provisions to the carrier bases. By 1944, men on Zuikaku reported in post-war accounts that the rice being served was of a quality clearly distinguishable from pre-war rations, older, stored longer, of inferior grade, and that the preserved fish stocks were being served in smaller portions than the standard ration specified. This decline was not dramatic, it was incremental. It was the specific type of deterioration that happens to an institution under sustained pressure, slow enough that no single week's ration was obviously different from the previous week's, progressive enough that comparing 1944's actual ration to 1941's specification revealed a gap that the medical officers attached to the carrier force documented and the naval staff absorbed without being able to meaningfully address, because the supply system was managing larger problems than the quality of the carrier crew's miso. The freshwater situation on Japanese fleet carriers was better than on destroyers and submarines, because the carrier's larger displacement and larger evaporator capacity allowed for a more adequate basic allocation, and because the carrier's operational pattern, extended periods at anchor or in port between major operations, provided opportunities for water replenishment that smaller combatants operating more continuously did not have. But better than destroyers was not adequate by any peacetime standard, and the communal bathing tradition of the Japanese naval furo, the bathhouse arrangement that was one of the few aspects of enlisted life aboard Japanese carriers that represented a genuine cultural provision for comfort, was dependent on water allocation that the carrier's operating schedule did not always reliably provide. The numbers that define what Japanese carrier service actually cost across the arc of the war deserve their concentrated examination because they tell a story that the Shining Spear narrative cannot be reconciled with. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the Japanese carrier force participated in its first engagement, where carrier aircraft attacked enemy carriers without any surface contact between the opposing forces. Shokaku was hit by 3 1,000-pound bombs and withdrew badly damaged, unable to participate in the Battle of Midway a month later. Zuikaku suffered heavy aircrew losses. The engagement was tactically inconclusive by most measures, but it established a pattern that the subsequent engagements would develop. The Japanese carrier air groups, whose pilots were among the finest trained naval aviators in the world at the war's start, were being attrited at rates that the Japanese training pipeline could not replenish at equivalent quality. This is the number that underlies everything else about Japanese carrier service: the training pipeline. Japanese naval aviators were trained to a standard that reflected years of investment. The pre-war training syllabus produced aviators with flight hours and skills that exceeded those of their American counterparts at the beginning of the war. The men who flew from Akagi and Kaga and Soryu and Hiryu at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean raids of early 1942 were the product of a training investment that had taken years to accumulate. When those men were lost, at Coral Sea, at Midway, in the Solomons campaign, the replacements that the training system produced were not equivalent. The training had been shortened by the war's demands. The flight hours were fewer. The specific competencies, night flying, long-range navigation over open ocean, coordinated multi-aircraft attack, that the original aviators had spent years developing, were not being produced in the replacement pilots at the same level. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the aircrew aboard Shokaku and Zuikaku and the other carriers of the mobile fleet were flying their aircraft with an average proficiency that the pre-war training system would not have considered adequate for carrier operations. They were not cowards. They were not poorly motivated. They were men who had been rushed through a shortened training pipeline in a war that was consuming experienced aviators faster than the system could replace them, flying aircraft against an American combat air patrol that had been specifically organized and trained for the task of killing Japanese aircraft before they could reach the American carriers. On June 19, 1944, the first day of the Philippine Sea battle, Japanese aircraft losses in combat with American fighters and anti-aircraft fire totaled 243 aircraft destroyed. American fighter pilots called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The pilots they were shooting down were young men, many of them on their first or second combat mission, flying from carriers whose experienced aircrew corps had been progressively destroyed over 2 years of operations that the doctrine had not been designed to survive. The men on the carrier decks who watched the aircraft depart and watched how many returned understood the arithmetic without being provided any official briefing. The aircraft departed in strength. They returned in fractions. The fractions decreased across the day. Shokaku herself was struck by 3 torpedoes from the American submarine USS Kavala on the morning of June 19th, before the day's air battle had concluded. The torpedo hits ignited aviation fuel from the line servicing aircraft that were being refueled for additional strike missions. The resulting fires spread through the carrier's spaces in the pattern that the Japanese carrier design's specific vulnerability had established at Midway. Fires that reached fuel and ordnance and produced secondary explosions that overwhelmed the damage control response. Shokaku sank at approximately 1500 on June 19th. Of her crew of approximately 1,760 men, roughly 1,272 were lost. 376 were rescued. The 376 men rescued from Shokaku were in the water of the Philippine Sea for periods ranging from minutes to several hours, depending on where they had been on the ship when she went down and how far from the rescue destroyers the current had moved them by the time the destroyers reached the sinking position. The water temperature was approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent hypothermia, not warm enough to matter to a man with injuries from the explosion and fires that had preceded the sinking in waters where the tactical situation made extended search and rescue operations a risk to the rescue ships that the fleet commander had to weigh against the lives in the water. The men rescued from Shokaku's crew were distributed to other ships of the mobile fleet and eventually returned to Japan. The ships they were assigned to after their recovery from the Philippine Sea were ships whose air groups had been similarly attrited. The carrier force they returned to was not the force they had served in 2 years earlier. It was a force that had lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway and was now in the process of losing 3 more in the Philippine Sea. Shokaku and Taiho on June 19th, Hio on June 20th. It was a force that was conducting operations with aircraft and air crew that the commander, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, privately assessed as inadequate for the mission he had been assigned, in a fleet engagement against an American carrier force whose material and training superiority had been specifically engineered for the past 18 months, while the Japanese carrier force had been rebuilt from the Midway losses, with what the training pipeline and the shipyards had managed to produce. The men on the carrier decks through this period, the hangar deck workers and the damage control parties and the engineering ratings and the anti-aircraft gun crews, were not participants in the strategic assessment. They were participants in its consequences. They armed aircraft for strikes they would not return from. They fueled aircraft for missions that the returning survivors described in terms that the tactical situation had already made clear would not be repeated by the same men. They manned the anti-aircraft guns as the American fighters came through the combat air patrol and attacked the carriers, and they fired at targets moving faster and at altitudes and angles that the pre-war anti-aircraft training had not fully prepared them for. The anti-aircraft defense of a Japanese fleet carrier in the middle and late war period was constrained by the same progressive degradation that had affected the air groups. Not a collapse, but a declining capability that expressed itself in specific ways. The 25mm anti-aircraft guns that formed the primary close-range defense of Japanese carriers against the Grumman F, 6F Hellcat at combat speed and altitude, flying an attack profile specifically designed by American tactical planners to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire, they were less capable. The gun crews who stood their positions as the Hellcats made their passes were doing what their training had specified, firing at targets their training had not fully replicated, in a tactical situation their doctrine had not anticipated. The specific incident that reaches into the center of what Japanese carrier service cost in human terms is not from one of the great battle sinkings. It is from the period immediately before the Philippine Sea, in the weeks when the mobile fleet was preparing for the engagement that everyone in the fleet's leadership understood would be decisive, and that the men on the carrier decks understood, in the way men understand things without being told them explicitly, was the kind of engagement from which some of them would not return. In late May and early June 1944, the Japanese carriers were at Tawi in the Sulu archipelago, in waters the naval staff had selected because they were relatively protected from American submarine operations. They were not, in fact, adequately protected. American submarines, Redfin, Harder, and others were operating in the area and reported the fleet's movements, providing the intelligence that told Admiral Spruance the Japanese carriers were coming and gave him time to position the American force advantageously. But from inside the fleet at Tawi, the anchorage was simply where the ships were, and what the men on the carriers experienced there was the combination of intense preparation for battle and the specific condition of being at anchor in tropical water, far from any port facility, with limited liberty, in heat that the ship's ventilation systems could manage only partially. The training flights that the carrier air groups conducted from Tawi were constrained by the local geography. The waters around the anchorage were not ideal for the extended flight training that the air group's partially trained pilots required, and the threat of American submarines made extended surface operations inadvisable, which meant that the fuel consumption for training sorties had to be balanced against the fuel reserves required for the coming battle. The carrier's air groups went into the Philippine Sea with pilots who had not received the full training preparation that the tactical situation required, in a logistical condition that the fuel management constraints of the pre-battle period had affected, in aircraft that the maintenance tempo of the pre-battle period had not allowed to be brought to full operational readiness across the entire air group. They went anyway because the battle had been ordered, and the battle's strategic purpose, stopping the American advance toward the Philippine Sea, was clear to everyone from Vice Admiral Ozawa to the youngest rating on the hangar deck. Among those ratings was Seaman First Class Masaru Okamoto of the carrier Zuikaku, 19 years old, from Nagasaki Prefecture, assigned to the hangar deck maintenance division since joining the carrier in March 1944. He was, by the time of the Philippine Sea battle, a man who had been on Zuikaku for 3 months and had never seen combat. He had fueled aircraft and positioned them and assisted the aircraft handlers and maintained the deck machinery and performed the specific physical labor of hangar deck service in tropical heat with the efficiency that 3 months of daily practice produces. On June 20th, 1944, the second day of the Philippine Sea battle, the day American carrier aircraft attacked the mobile fleet in a late afternoon strike that sank Hio and damaged Zuikaku and several other ships. Okamoto was at his station on the upper hangar deck when the attack began. He was not injured in the attack. Zuikaku survived the Philippine Sea battle, one of only 2 fleet carriers of the force to do so intact. She returned to Japan for repair and reinforcement. Okamoto remained aboard Zuikaku through the Leyte Gulf operation in October 1944, the final major Japanese carrier operation of the war, in which Zuikaku served as the centerpiece of Vice Admiral Ozawa's decoy force specifically designed to draw the American fast carrier forces away from the Leyte Gulf landings. Zuikaku's air group at Leyte Gulf consisted of approximately 116 aircraft. She was also carrying hundreds of additional crew members from the previously sunk carriers Shokaku, Taiho, and Chiyoda, survivors who had been redistributed to the remaining carrier. On October 25, 1944, Ozawa's decoy force was found by American aircraft from Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38. The attack that followed was coordinated, sustained, and systematic. Zuikaku was hit by at least 6 torpedoes and 7 bomb hits over the course of the morning and afternoon. She began to list to port. Around 1400, it became clear that the list was irreversible. The order to abandon ship was given. Okamoto went into the Philippine Sea. He was 20 years old. He had served on Zuikaku for 7 months. He had been on the ship during Coral Sea's aftermath, during the preparation for Philippine Sea, during the Philippine Sea battle itself, and through the months of refit and preparation for Leyte Gulf. He was a man who had spent 7 months on a ship whose history had been the history of the Japanese carrier force's decline from its peak capability to its final operational defeat, performing hangar deck work in tropical heat for that entire period. Without having been in a senior enough position to be informed of any of the strategic assessments that had shaped the decisions determining where he was and what he was doing, he was in the water for 2 hours before a Japanese destroyer found him. He was one of approximately 842 survivors from a crew and passenger complement that had grown, with the Shokaku and Taiho survivors aboard, to approximately 1,700 people. The other 858 went down with Zuikaku. Zuikaku was the last fleet carrier of the 6 that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, still operational at her sinking. When she went down, a specific era of Japanese naval history ended in a way that was complete and absolute, and that the men who watched her flag being dipped as she rolled over understood as something beyond a tactical loss. Okamoto survived. He was taken to a Japanese base in the Philippines and eventually returned to Japan by transport in early 1945. He was assigned to shore duty for the rest of the war. He returned to Nagasaki Prefecture after Japan's surrender, and he was there on August 9, 1945, when the second atomic bomb was dropped on the city. He survived that as well. He worked for 38 years as a maintenance worker in a shipyard in Nagasaki, maintaining ships that were being built for peacetime purposes in a harbor that the war had changed permanently. He retired in 1983. He died in 1999 at the age of 75. His son, in an account deposited with the Nagasaki Prefecture Historical Archive in 2006, described visiting his father at the shipyard once and asking him what it had been like on the carrier. His father said the heat on the hangar deck was the thing he remembered most specifically. He said the heat had a particular quality in the enclosed hangar that it did not have anywhere else. The heat of machinery and fuel, and the bodies of men working in it all at once, in a space that was sealed and could not cool. He said he had worked in the Nagasaki shipyard for 38 years in spaces that were sometimes very hot, and that the heat never felt the same as the hangar deck heat. He said he did not know how to explain the difference except that one was just heat and the other had been something else underneath the heat, something that the heat was the surface of rather than the substance. His son said he understood. He said later that he had not understood, but that he had known better than to say so.